It is a grey Tuesday evening in the spring of 1940, and somewhere in the English countryside, a man sits before a microphone and clears his throat. He is not who he claims to be. The voice that emerges is not his own, not precisely. It is an imitation so carefully constructed, so meticulously researched, that the German soldiers tuning in that very night in France, in Poland, in the barracks of the Reich itself, have no reason whatsoever to doubt what they are hearing. They believe, with complete confidence, that they are listening to a German radio station. They are not. They are listening to a British one, and they will not discover the truth for 2 full years. This is the story of Soldatensender Calais, the Soldiers' Station Calais, one of the most audacious, most brilliantly executed deception operations in the history of psychological warfare. It was not a bomb. It was not a tank. It was a wireless transmitter and a handful of extraordinarily gifted people, and together they did something that conventional weapons could never quite achieve. They got inside the enemy's head. But how did the British keep this secret for so long? And what made this particular weapon so different from anything that had come before it? To understand the answer, you need to understand just how desperate the situation was in those early years of the war. By late 1940, France had fallen. The British Expeditionary Force had been rescued from the beaches of Dunkirk by a miracle of improvisation. But the damage was done. Germany controlled the coastline across the Channel. The Luftwaffe had fought the RAF to something approaching a draw in the skies over Britain. But that was a defensive victory. It stopped an invasion. It did not push one back. Britain was, in the most blunt terms, losing. Conventional propaganda had been attempted, of course. The BBC's German language service broadcast dutifully into the Reich, but it was about as likely to be listened to by ordinary German soldiers as a German newspaper was likely to be read voluntarily by a Tommy in the trenches. The moment a listener recognized the source as British, he turned it off. The human mind is a stubborn and tribal thing, and a man will rarely sit and listen patiently to someone telling him that his country is wrong and that his leaders are liars. He will simply switch to a different frequency. What was needed was something altogether more cunning. Not propaganda that announced itself as propaganda, but propaganda that disguised itself as something the target audience already trusted, their own media. The idea, elegant in its simplicity and almost impossibly difficult in its execution, was to create a radio station that sounded, felt, and behaved exactly like a legitimate German military broadcaster. And then, underneath the music and the military bulletins, and the comfortable, familiar tone of a broadcaster who understood his audience, to quietly, methodically, inexorably undermine the German war effort from within. The man tasked with making this happen was Sefton Delmer. He was, on paper, an unlikely weapon. A journalist by trade, he had been the Daily Express's Berlin correspondent in the 1930s and had sat in rooms with Adolf Hitler himself, interviewing him as an equal. He spoke German not merely fluently but natively. His childhood had been spent in Berlin, and he understood the culture, the humor, the class anxieties, and the professional grievances of ordinary German servicemen in a way that almost no other British operator could claim. He was brash, unconventional, and possessed of a talent for creative deception that bordered on the inspired. Delmer operated out of a country house in Bedfordshire called Wavendon Manor, and later from a considerably larger operation at Milton Bryan, a purpose-built facility that Delmer and his team quietly referred to as MB. The work done there was, for obvious reasons, kept under the strictest possible secrecy. Most of those involved signed the Official Secrets Act and maintained their silence for decades. Some never spoke of it publicly at all. The technical side of the operation was formidable. To be convincing, the station needed power, real, substantial broadcasting power, because a weak signal announcing itself as coming from Calais, which was by that point in German hands, would be immediately suspicious. The transmitter eventually employed was one of the most powerful in Britain, capable of broadcasting on shortwave and medium wave frequencies that could reach deep into German-occupied Europe. The station was designed to share, or appear to share, the same frequency as legitimate German broadcasters, meaning that a soldier casually spinning the dial on his wireless set might land on it without any particular effort or intention. It would simply be there where a German station ought to be. The content was the real genius of the operation. Soldatensender Calais did not broadcast enemy propaganda in the crude sense of the word. It did not announce, "Germany is losing, your leaders are corrupt, surrender now." That would have been worse than useless. Instead, it broadcast exactly the sort of material that genuine German military radio would have broadcast: popular music. And there was a great deal of very good popular music, news bulletins, sports results, and the kind of warm, intimate, knowing chat that suggested the broadcaster was one of them. A fellow German, a fellow soldier, a man who understood the particular frustrations and indignities of military life in the middle of a long and grinding war. The station addressed German servicemen as Kameraden, comrades. It used authentic slang. It referenced real military units, real place names, real logistical details. Some of this information was obtained through intelligence channels. Some came from prisoners of war who provided, knowingly or otherwise, the texture and vocabulary needed to make the fiction convincing. If a unit had suffered a particular hardship, a botched supply delivery, a miserable billet, an unpopular commanding officer, the station might reference it casually and sympathetically in a way that made listeners feel that someone on their side understood their situation. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. And then, nestled within all of that, gradually, carefully, incrementally, came the poison. Not accusations, not arguments, rumors, whispers, the sort of information that could not be directly disproved because it was designed to be unverifiable. A senior officer known for corruption, a supply chain that was failing its men not through Allied bombing, but through German administrative incompetence, a decorated general whose nerve was quietly failing him. None of it was necessarily true. All of it was plausible. And plausibility, in the hands of someone as skilled as Sefton Delmer and his team, was a more powerful weapon than accuracy. The station ran from late 1943, though the groundwork and earlier iterations of the deception had been developing since 1940 through a predecessor operation called Gustav Siegfried I. In its mature form, Soldatensender Calais broadcast continuously, not just for a few hours in the evening, as a limited propaganda operation might, but around the clock, maintaining the appearance and texture of a genuine military broadcaster with resources and a schedule and a proper staff. Records of specific individual impact are, as one might expect, difficult to verify. Psychological warfare operations are not like artillery barrages. There is no crater left behind, no measurable unit of damage per shell fired. What the Allied intelligence services did gather, however, was suggestive. Intercepts of German military communications showed soldiers discussing the station. Prisoners of war, when questioned, mentioned it with a familiarity that confirmed they had been regular listeners. Some expressed genuine confusion when told, after the war, that it had been British. A number had not believed it even then. The German authorities were aware that something unusual was happening on the airwaves. Goebbels' propaganda ministry monitored enemy broadcasts as a matter of course, and Soldatensender Calais attracted notice. But the genius of the operation lay precisely in how difficult it was to counter. You cannot publicly denounce a station as enemy propaganda without drawing attention to it and prompting your own listeners to seek it out. You cannot simply jam it without disrupting legitimate German frequencies in the same range. And you cannot easily explain to your own troops that the sympathetic, informed, knowledgeable broadcaster, who seemed to understand their grievances so perfectly, was, in fact, sitting in a country house in Bedfordshire. Germany did attempt its own version of the technique. Radio Caledonia, for instance, was a German station that posed as a Scottish nationalist broadcaster, attempting to sow disaffection among British listeners. It did not achieve anything approaching the impact of Soldatensender Calais, in large part because the German operators lacked the intimate cultural knowledge that men like Delmer possessed. Understanding a culture from the outside, however well briefed, is not the same as having grown up inside it. Delmer had lived in Germany as a child. He had eaten the food, spoken the language in its natural habitat, and absorbed the texture of ordinary German life in a way that no amount of briefing papers could replicate. The Americans ran their own black propaganda operations with stations like the American Broadcasting Station in Europe, but these were largely acknowledged operations, grey propaganda rather than black, and operated on rather different principles. The British model of total deception, the complete fictional identity maintained without acknowledgement, was not widely replicated because it was extraordinarily difficult to sustain. It required not just technical resources, but an almost theatrical commitment to the fiction, a willingness to inhabit the role of the enemy broadcaster so completely that not a single element broke the spell. The legacy of Soldatensender Calais is difficult to quantify and easy to underestimate. It did not win the war. No single operation did. But in the specific and limited domain of psychological warfare, it established something that would influence every subsequent operation of its kind. The principle that the most effective propaganda is the propaganda that does not announce itself as propaganda. That a listener who does not know he is being deceived cannot defend himself against the deception. That morale, the invisible, immeasurable thing that keeps a soldier fighting when the rational calculation might suggest he should stop, is a target as legitimate and as valuable as any fuel depot or railway junction. When the war ended and the Allied forces moved through Germany, they found a population that was, in many cases, more thoroughly informed about the actual state of the conflict than their own newspapers had allowed. Some of that information had come from the BBC. Some, historians argue, had been quietly absorbed from stations that Germans had assumed to be their own. The facilities at Milton Bryan were quietly decommissioned. Sefton Delmer returned to journalism. The transmitters were repurposed. The files were classified, and many of them remained that way for decades. Some of the people who had worked there, the German émigrés, the writers and musicians, and translators who had spent years performing this extraordinary double life, went on to careers in broadcasting, in film, in literature, never mentioning their wartime work to colleagues who would not have believed it in any case. And somewhere, in the archive boxes of the Public Record Office at Kew, among the neatly labelled folders and the carbon copies and the handwritten schedules of broadcasts that were never supposed to exist, you can find the transcripts of what was said on those evenings when a man sat before a microphone in the English countryside and spoke to the enemy in the enemy's own voice. He told them their music. He told them their scores. He told them gently and persistently and with the absolute confidence of a man who knew exactly what he was doing, that things were not entirely as they seemed. He was right. And for 2 full years, they had no idea where his voice was coming from.